I lived with that thought for 3/4 of an hour. I faced the last moment, and now I'm alive again. These powerful words were written by Fyodor Dostoevsky in a letter after one of the most harrowing experiences of his life, his mock execution in 1849. At just 27 years old, Dostoevsky had been sentenced to death by firing squad for his involvement in a liberal literary circle. He was led to the execution site, forced to wear a white shroud, made to kiss the cross, and stand before the guns, only to be spared at the very last second by a surprise reprieve from the Tsar. I will discuss this in detail in just a few minutes, because this was one of the most significant and emotional moments in young Dostoevsky's life, which later helped shape him as well. The emotional impact of that moment was beyond words. In a letter to his brother, he later wrote, "Life is everywhere. Life is in us. Not to lose heart and not to grow despondent. Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Each moment could have been an eternity of happiness." In this video, we'll walk with Dostoevsky through that personal hell, from the terror of that snowy execution square in St. Petersburg to the brutal years he spent after. But more importantly, we'll see how every one of those trials forged the psychological depth, empathy, and spiritual insight that made Dostoevsky one of the greatest writers in human history. And maybe, just maybe, his story can remind people like me, and perhaps many of you watching, that even in the darkest places, something great can be born. So let's begin. In 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky, at just 27 years old, became a member of the Petrushevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals secretly gathering to discuss banned Western philosophy and political reform. But in Tsarist Russia, even ideas could be dangerous. The secret police arrested Dostoevsky for the simple crime of listening to stories that criticized the armed forces and for allegedly plotting against the Tsar. On the freezing morning of December 22, 1849, they were marched to Semyonovsky Square in St. Petersburg. The scene that followed would leave an indelible mark on Dostoevsky's soul. Each prisoner was solemnly read his death sentence. Dostoevsky stood blindfolded, listening as, 3 by 3, the men were led before the firing squad. He knew that at any moment, he could be next. Then, in a cruel twist, an imperial messenger arrived and announced a last-minute pardon from Tsar Nicholas I. What no one knew, except the Tsar, was that this reprieve had been planned all along. The mock execution was a staged punishment, meant to break the spirit of the rebels and remind the public of the absolute power of the regime. Dostoevsky's sentence was commuted to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by mandatory military service. But the psychological impact of that day would never leave him. He had stared into death's face and been pulled back at the final moment. It was, in his own words, a kind of rebirth. In a letter to his brother Mikhail, written shortly after the event, he exclaimed, "Brother, I'm not despondent, and I haven't lost heart. Life is everywhere. There will be people by my side, to remain human no matter in what circumstances." This direct confrontation with mortality awakened something profound in Dostoevsky, an almost sacred reverence for life and human connection. Yet even in the relief of survival, a writer's dread lingered. He feared exile would mean the end of his creative life. "Can it be that I'll never take pen in hand?" he lamented. "If I won't be able to write, I'll perish. Better 15 years of imprisonment and a pen in hand." The trauma of that execution day haunted him for the rest of his life and echoed throughout his fiction. In short, the man who was nearly executed that winter morning never truly died, but was reborn with a vision shaped by darkness and a voice that would speak to millions. The firing squad didn't end his life. It gave him one. And what made it worse and better at the same time is his lessons that he learned in Siberian prison, which I am going to discuss now. After the terror of his mock execution, Dostoevsky's real punishment began: 4 grueling years of katorga, forced labor, in the remote penal colony of Omsk, Siberia, followed by several years of compulsory military service. The conditions were nightmarish. Shackled alongside murderers and thieves, prisoners endured bitter cold, relentless labor, and frequent beatings. Hunger, filth, disease, and cruelty were part of everyday existence. These years would break many men, but for Dostoevsky, they became the crucible that transformed his soul and reshaped his entire worldview. He later immortalized this experience in his semi-autobiographical novel, Notes from the House of the Dead. Through the narrator, Alexander Petrovich, a clear stand-in for himself, Dostoevsky painted a vivid and disturbing portrait of prison life. The novel spares no detail: sadistic guards, the casual use of flogging, fellow convicts guilty of the most unspeakable crimes. It was, as critics have described, a traumatic encounter with suffering, and Dostoevsky met that trauma head-on, recording it with a precision that few writers have ever matched. But Siberia didn't just punish him. It stripped him down and rebuilt him. He was treated with suspicion by peasants and contempt by criminals. Surrounded by broken men, he slowly let go of the prejudices he once held. In his own reflections, he wrote that during imprisonment, he overcame his preconceptions and his repulsion, and in doing so, came to recognize the intense humanity and moral qualities of those around him. Amid misery, he found flashes of humor, dignity, even tenderness. That realization changed him. The angry young revolutionary became something else, a witness to suffering and a seeker of meaning within it. He would later say that the prison years annealed him, made him unafraid of future hardship. That transformation is visible not only in his character, but in his literature. The psychological depth and moral sensitivity that define his great novels were born here, among Siberia's cold barracks and brutal punishments. He once remarked, "It killed off in me the needs of the flesh that were not completely pure. Now deprivations no longer bother me." The experience had burned away excess, leaving only what mattered. It was also in Siberia that another shadow entered Dostoevsky's life: epilepsy. He suffered his first seizures during imprisonment, and the condition would plague him for the rest of his days. But even this became part of his art. He called it his sacred disease, and it lent mystical insight and vulnerability to characters like Prince Mishkin in The Idiot. His personal agony, physical, emotional, spiritual, was transmuted into literature with unmatched intensity. And when he was finally released, he was not the same man. Physically free, yes, but spiritually altered forever. He had endured the worst of humanity, and yet discovered that even in the darkest places, compassion and goodness could flicker through. Life and hope remain even after the abyss of human cruelty, he wrote in a letter, long after leaving Siberia. The belief that suffering could be redemptive, that even in hell, the soul could grow, would become a cornerstone of Dostoevsky's greatest works. And it all began in the frozen wastelands of Omsk, where a young writer, sentenced to silence, began to find his truest voice. But something changed after his exile. A bad thing happened again, which I am going to discuss now. After years in exile, Dostoevsky returned to a Russia that had changed, and to a life haunted by the same demons that had always followed him. Chief among them was an all-consuming gambling addiction that would nearly destroy him. In the late 1850s and throughout the 1860s, Dostoevsky became obsessed with roulette. What began as a curiosity during his travels in Europe quickly spiraled into a pattern of self-destruction. He described the experience as the wildest hysteria of the soul, the maddest delirium of hope. In city after city, he threw away everything he earned, even money meant for his family. The losses were not just financial, they corroded his relationships, fueled self-loathing, and pushed him to the brink of ruin. By 1865, Dostoevsky was penniless. Every bet became existential. In his own mind, it was all or nothing. Then came the breaking point. In 1866, facing crushing debts and complete financial collapse, Dostoevsky made a desperate pact with the publisher F.T. Stolovsky. The deal was severe. If he failed to deliver a short novel, 12 publishing signatures, by November 1st, he would forfeit the rights to all of his future work for the next 9 years. It was a literary death sentence in disguise. He hired a 20-year-old stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, and began dictating furiously. Working side by side in fevered intensity, they raced against the clock. Anna later recalled the urgency and madness of those days, how she shaped his chaotic thoughts into clean prose, and how he entrusted the final manuscript to a policeman to ensure it reached the publisher in time. Against all odds, they succeeded. The Gambler was finished just before the deadline and published the following year. The novel, set in a hotel and casino, mirrored Dostoevsky's own descent into addiction. But this wasn't just a book. It was a turning point. In the chaos of saving the Gambler, Dostoevsky found something unexpected: love. Anna, the quiet, focused stenographer who helped rescue his career, became his anchor. They married in 1867, and her steady presence brought a stability he had never known. She wasn't just his wife. She became his creative partner, his editor, and his emotional support through the final decades of his life. Thanks to Anna, Dostoevsky emerged from the nightmare not broken, but renewed. At 42, he finally had a home, a steady income, and someone who believed in him unconditionally. The gambling never fully disappeared. The urge lingered like a shadow. But the worst was over. The debts were paid, the contracts fulfilled, and the desperation that had ruled his life began to fade. The Gambler may not be his greatest novel, but it is perhaps his most revealing. It captures a man on the edge, staring into the abyss of his own compulsions. And yet, in that moment of collapse, he managed to turn ruin into art. The novel stands as a snapshot of Dostoevsky's darkest year, and the moment when, against all odds, he won the right to begin again. But even after finding love and stability with Anna, Dostoevsky could not escape the long shadow of tragedy, which I am going to discuss now. In April 1864, his first wife, Maria Dmitrievna, whom he had married in 1857, died of tuberculosis. Her passing left him briefly a widower, grieving deeply while also responsible for her children. That same year, as if fate weren't finished with him, his beloved brother Mikhail also died. These twin losses struck Dostoevsky at the heart, plunging him once again into grief, financial strain, and emotional solitude. And yet, with Anna by his side, Dostoevsky traveled to Germany in 1865. While abroad, he began channeling his pain into what would become one of his most celebrated novels. On the journey back, he drafted the first version of Crime and Punishment, published in 1866. Critics have long pointed to the eerie parallels between Raskolnikov's inner torment and Dostoevsky's own mental and emotional collapse during 1864-65. Dostoevsky himself admitted he wrote the novel honestly from my own wounds and sufferings, suggesting that the guilt, alienation, and struggle for redemption in the novel weren't merely fictional, they were drawn straight from his soul. The novel was a sensation. It proved that Dostoevsky could turn the rawest materials of his life, shame, despair, moral confusion, into something universal and transcendent. But he didn't stop there. In 1868, he published The Idiot, a radically different novel that explored goodness and innocence in a world that seemed to crush both. Its protagonist, Prince Mishkin, is Dostoevsky's vision of a truly good man, gentle, selfless, and childlike in spirit. returning to Russian society after years in a Swiss clinic, much like Dostoevsky's own return from Siberian exile. In parallel to his major novels, Dostoevsky also produced shorter works that revealed the dark and fractured parts of his psyche. In Notes from Underground, the narrator is a bitter, isolated man lashing out at a world he cannot connect with, a reflection of Dostoevsky's own alienation during his darkest periods. By the late 1860s, Dostoevsky had done something few writers ever accomplish. He turned every personal catastrophe into art. But instead of bitterness, what emerged was empathy. Anyway, this was a brief synopsis of a man who can help you live a better life than any self-help book ever could. And I'll end my video with this powerful line from Fyodor Dostoevsky. Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled, and if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say that you've wasted time.